For as long as film has existed, directors all over the cinematic world have been using battle scenes and depictions of war and violence as a means of visual storytelling, whether it be to explain non-fictional historical events, or as a means of progressing the stories of fictional settings. Some of these battle scenes are often considered to be masterpieces by both film critics and movie-going audiences alike, and are often considered to be works of art in their own right, while some battle scenes are less than impressive. When you think of the most authentic battle scenes ever put on the big screen, what might come to mind for you? Do you think of the Omaha landings in Saving Private Ryan, the brutal street-to-street fighting in Black Hawk Down, or the excellently choreographed Battle of Stirling from Braveheart?
Oh, but you can't have a Battle of Stirling Bridge without a bridge, now can you, laddie?
Shut the hell up.
I wouldn't blame you for holding these battle scenes or any others like them as your favorite ever made. The screams, the blood, and immersion that's written into these battles are enough to disturb and leave impressions on almost anyone who watches them, including me. I saw Saving Private Ryan when I was 9, man, and it was horrifying. But even still, these battles, to me, are not number one, even if they are very close to it. In my opinion, the most historically authentic battle scene ever put to film is one you've likely never even heard of. That being the French charge on the German trench in All Quiet on the Western Front. All Quiet on the Western Front was a World War I film released in 1930, based on the book of the same name. The book was written with underlying sentiments of anti-war and anti-nationalism, all while the events are depicted through the eyes of the everyday, average German soldier in the trenches. Because of these sentiments, it's no surprise why the Nazi regime that rose to power only a few years later would ban this book, along with many others like it. Though the immediate characters and events in the book are works of historical fiction, they're meant to serve as self-inserts on behalf of the author, Erich Remarque, who was a German veteran of World War I, and as a result, the events of the book feel as though they could have really happened the way they were written. And by extension, the battle shown in the film itself feels like a real World War I battle that just so happened to be expertly shot. And I think that may be what I find so alluring about this battle. It may not have as much gore or expert choreography as other films, but in terms of authenticity, I don't think it really gets much better than this. The beginning of the battle scene starts off silent. Officers give orders to their men to take up positions, and soldiers look on in anticipation as they heartily value each passing second that they're not killing or being killed. But of course, the silence doesn't last long. All of a sudden, the whistle of artillery fills the air, and no man's land erupts into flames. Is the shelling from the French? From the Germans? Who knows? Maybe it's German, as most of the shells are falling onto the open ground ahead. But on the other hand, some of the shells fall dangerously close to the German trench, almost deliberately. But in the eyes of the men in the trench, it hardly matters either way. As frightening as the artillery might be, it's likely not going to be what kills them that day anyway. Cut to the French soldiers that have begun their charge. They have no choice but to march into the heavy shelling. If they don't, they'll surely be shot by their own officers. Better to take your chances out in the open than against a friendly NCO. The living are not the only victim to the explosions and shrapnel, but the dead as well. Bodies of long-dead soldiers of previous charges are also hit by the artillery. The craters that provide the only semblance of cover between the trenches are proven to be death traps, as men who take cover in them are blown apart by artillery that lands directly into the deep holes. The worst hasn't begun yet, though. Once the French are in range, machine guns open up on the exposed French lines. Entire platoons of men are cut down in only seconds. Only shortly after the machine guns, the rifles join in. Then hand grenades start being thrown. The sounds of battle have become so loud and numerous that none of the sounds can be distinguished from one another. They just all blend together and create a deafening monotone droning. But despite the fact that hundreds of French soldiers must have been killed already by this point, there are still too many of them. Too many for the Germans to kill. And that's when they finally charge into the trench. Bayonets reached outwardly as they leap down. Some Germans react fast enough to avoid the initial wave of bayonets. Some are stabbed through the chest. If they didn't die instantly, then they would soon. As the brutal hand-to-hand fighting begins, the bodies begin to pile up. In a very literal sense, men have to resort to walking on the fallen French and German soldiers. They were wounded before, and by now they've likely been trampled to death, or have suffocated underneath the weight of the many bodies on top of them. Many soldiers by this point have resorted to using their shovels as their main weapons. The rifles are too long and clumsy to use in the trenches effectively, and besides, The bayonet often got stuck between the ribs of the man you're stabbing, which would likely get you killed in the amount of time it took to take it out. The shovel was much more effective. You could halfway decapitate someone with it in the time it took to stab them, and the shovel wouldn't even get stuck in them either. After only maybe a minute or two of brutal close-quarters combat, the Germans are overwhelmed and are forced to retreat. However, to the dismay of the French, their officers aren't satisfied. Despite the heavy casualties, they're ordered to charge the second German trench. The Germans and French alike take potshots at one another as they both advance along the second stretch of no man's land. Once the Germans reach the safety of their second trench, they take the time to rest and to think. They knew they would have to fight the French again soon, and they likely thought none of them would survive a second wave. However, the French never reach the next trench. Heavy artillery fire breaks the French morale, and they run their way back to the trench they'd taken mere minutes ago. The German NCOs waste no time. Countercharges ordered against the French. All the while, the French soldiers on the ground beg for help from the Germans. Being left in no man's land was the death sentence for wounded soldiers, and it'd be better to be a POW than to be left to die. But no one ever comes for them. The soldiers are left there and likely forgotten about, if they were ever even noticed in the first place. Some of the French soldiers attempt to hold the German trench that was just occupied, even having a machine gun setup that shoots down a number of Germans. But this time, the Germans overwhelm the French. The French that aren't killed are finally driven out of German lines. The Germans quickly get to work redeploying along their old lines, and just like that, the battle comes to an end just as soon as it started, with nothing being gained by either side.
Their own line. Turn left. I'm jogging. Get out of there.
This battle will never be given a name, despite the fact that hundreds of men had just died along a stretch of land that's maybe half a mile in length if we're being generous. It was an insignificant event, and in the eyes of the powers that be, it might as well have never have happened. Battles just like this one were being fought in the hundreds all over the Western Front every day, and likely the same one would be fought along this same stretch of land the next day. Such was the nature of the Great War. A war where thousands of men were killed on the daily, and where the actions of single soldiers were meaningless, and indeed the actions of entire battalions of men were meaningless. They fought for nothing, and they died for nothing, and at the end of the day, that's what makes this battle scene so authentic.